coverage of the subject. Bias from liking distortion, including the tendency to especially like oneself, one's own kind, and one's own idea structures, and the tendency to be especially susceptible to being misled by someone liked. Disliking distortion, bias from that. The reciprocal of liking distortion, and the tendency not to learn appropriately from someone disliked. Well, here again we've got hugely powerful tendencies, and if you look at the wars in part of the Harvard Law School as we sit here, you can see that very brilliant people get into this almost pathological behavior. And these are very, very powerful, basic, subconscious psychological tendencies, or at least partly subconscious. Now let's get back to B.F. Skinner, man with a hammer syndrome revisited. Why is man with the hammer syndrome always present? Well, if you stop to think about it, it's incentive-caused bias. His professional reputation is all tied up with what he knows. He likes himself and he likes his own ideas, and he's expressed them to other people. Consistency and commitment tendency. I mean, you got 4 or 5 of these elementary psychological tendencies combining to create this man with a hammer syndrome. And once you realize that you can't really buy your thinking done, partly you can, but largely you can't in this world, you have learned a lesson that's very useful in life. George Bernard Shaw said, and had a character say in The Doctor's Dilemma, in the last analysis, every profession is a conspiracy against the laity. But he didn't have it quite right, because it isn't so much a conspiracy as it is a subconscious psychological tendency. The guy tells you what is good for him. He doesn't recognize that he's doing anything wrong any more than that doctor did when he was pulling out all those normal gallbladders. And he believes that his own idea structures will cure cancer. And he believes that the demons that he's the guardian against are the biggest demons and the most important ones. And in fact, they may be very small demons compared to the demons that you face. So you're getting your advice in this world from your paid advisor with this huge load of ghastly bias. And woe to you. There are only 2 ways to handle it. You can hire your advisor and then just apply a windage factor, like I used to do when I was a rifle shooter. I just adjust for so many miles an hour of wind. Or you can learn the basic elements of your advisor's trade. You don't have to learn very much, by the way, because you learn just a little, and then you can make him explain why he's right. And those 2 tendencies will take part of the warp out of the thinking you've tried to hire done. By and large, it works terribly. I have never seen a management consultant's report in my long life that didn't end with the following paragraph. What this situation really needs is more management consulting. Never once. I always turn to the last page. Of course, Berkshire Hathaway doesn't hire them, so I only do this on sort of a voyeuristic basis. Sometimes I'm in a non-profit where some idiot hires one. Bias from the non-mathematical nature of the human brain in its natural state, as it deals with probabilities employing crude heuristics, and is often misled by mere contrast, a tendency to overweigh conveniently available information, and other psychologically rooted misthinking tendencies on this list, when the brain should be using the simple probability mathematics of Fermat and Pascal, applied to all reasonably obtainable and correctly weighted items of information that are of value in predicting outcomes. The right way to think is the way Zeckhauser plays bridge. It's just that simple. And your brain doesn't naturally know how to think the way Zeckhauser knows how to play bridge. Now, you notice I put in that availability thing, and there I'm mimicking some very eminent psychologists, Kahneman, I hope I pronounced that right, and Tversky, who raised the idea of availability to a whole heuristic of misjudgment. And, they are very substantially right. I mean, ask the Coca-Cola Company, which has raised availability to a secular religion. Availability changes behavior. You will drink a hell of a lot more Coke if it's always available. I mean, availability does change behavior and cognition. Nonetheless, even though I recognize that and applaud Tversky and Kahneman, I don't like it for my personal system, except as part of a greater subsystem, which is you got to think the way Zeckhauser plays the bridge. It isn't just the lack of availability that distorts your judgment. All the things on this list distort judgment. And I want to train myself to kind of mentally run down the list instead of just jumping on availability. So that's why I state it the way I do. In a sense, these psychological tendencies make things unavailable. Because if you quickly jump to one thing, and then because you've jumped to it, the consistency and commitment tendency makes you lock in, boom, that's error number one. Or if something is very vivid, which I'm going to come to next, that will really pound in. And the reason that the thing that really matters is now unavailable, and what's extra vivid wins, is, I mean, the extra vividness creates the unavailability. So I think it's much better to have a whole list of things that cause you to be less like Zeckhauser than it is just to jump on one factor. Here, I think we should discuss John Gutfriend. This is a very interesting human example which will be taught in every decent professional school for at least a full generation. Gutfriend has a trusted employee, and it comes to light, not through confession, but by accident, that the trusted employee has lied like hell to the government, manipulated the accounting system, and it was really equivalent to forgery. And the man immediately says, I've never done it before, I'll never do it again, it was an isolated example. And of course it was obvious that he was trying to help the government as well as himself, because he thought the government had been dumb enough to pass a rule that he'd spoken against. And after all, if a government's not going to pay attention to a bond trader, it's all going to be. And at any rate, and this guy has been part of a little clique that has made, well, way over $1 billion for Solomon in the very recent past. And it's a little handful of people. And so there are a lot of psychological forces at work. And you know the guy's wife, and he's right in front of you, and there's human sympathy, and he's sort of asking for your help, which is a form which encourages reciprocation, and there are all these psychological tendencies are working, plus the fact he's part of a group that made a lot of money for you. At any rate, Gutfriend does not cashier the man. And of course, he had done it before, and he did do it again. Well, now you look as though you almost wanted him to do it again. Or God knows what you look like, but it isn't good. And that simple decision destroyed John Gutfriend. And it's so easy to do. Now let's think it through like the bridge player, like Zeckhauser. You find an isolated example of a little old lady in the Seas Candy Company, one of our subsidiaries, getting into the till. And what does she say? I never did it before. I'll never do it again. This is going to ruin my life. Please help me. And you know her children and her friends, and she's been around 30 years, and standing behind the candy counter with swollen ankles, and you're an old lady, it isn't that glorious a life. And you're rich and powerful, and there she is. I never did it before, and I'll never do it again. Well, how likely is it that she never did it before? If you're going to catch 10 embezzlements a year, what are the chances that any one of them, applying what Tversky and Kahneman call baseline information, will be somebody who only did it this once? And the people who have done it before and are going to do it again, what are they all going to say? Well, in the history of the Seas Candy Company, they always say, I never did it before, and I'm never going to do it again. And we cashier them. It would be evil not to, because terribly behavior spreads. Remember, what was it, Serpico? I mean, you let that stuff, you got social proof, you got incentive caused bias, you got a whole lot of psychological factors that will cause the evil behavior to spread. And pretty soon the whole damn, your place is rotten, the civilization is rotten. It's not the right way to behave. And I will admit that when I knew the wife and children, I have paid severance pay when I fire somebody for taking a mistress on an extended foreign trip. It's not the adultery I mind, it's the embezzlement. But there, I wouldn't do it where Gutfriend did it, where they've been cheating somebody else on my behalf. There, I think you have to cashier. But if they're just stealing from you, and you get rid of them, I don't think you need the last ounce of vengeance. In fact, I don't think you need any vengeance. I don't think vengeance is much good. Now we come bias from over-influence by extra vivid evidence. Here's one that I'm at least $30 million poorer as I sit here giving this little talk because I once bought 300 shares of a stock, and the guy called me back and said, I've got 1,500 more. I said, will you hold it for 15 minutes while I think about it? And the CEO of this company, I have seen a lot of vivid peculiarities in a long life, but this guy set a world record. I'm talking about the CEO, and I just misweighed it. The truth of the matter is his situation was foolproof. He was soon going to be dead. I turned down the extra 1,500 shares, and it's now cost me $30 million, and that's life in the big city. And it wasn't something where stock was generally available. And so it's very easy to misweigh the vivid evidence. And Goodfriend did that when he looked into the man's eyes and forgave the colleague. And 22, stress-induced mental changes, small and large, temporary and permanent. I've skipped one. Mental confusion caused by information not arrayed in the mind in theory structures, creating sound generalizations developed in response to the question, why? Also misinfluence from information that apparently but not really answers the question, why? Also failure to obtain deserved influence caused by not properly explaining why. Well, we all know people who flunk, and they try and memorize, and they try and spout back, and it doesn't work. The brain doesn't work that way. You've got to array facts, theory structures, answering the question, why? If you don't do that, you cannot handle the world. And now we get to Feuerstein, who was the general counsel of Salomon when Goodfriend made his big error. And Feuerstein knew better. He told Goodfriend, you have to report this as a matter of morality and prudent business judgment. He said, it's probably not illegal, there's probably no legal duty to do it, but you have to do it as a matter of prudent conduct and proper dealing with your main customer. And he said that to Goodfriend on at least 2 or 3 occasions. And he stopped. And of course the persuasion failed. And when Goodfriend went down, Feuerstein went with him. Ruined a considerable part of Feuerstein's life. Well, Feuerstein was a member of the Harvard Law Review, made an elementary psychological mistake. You want to persuade somebody, you really tell them why. And what have we learned in lesson 1? Incentives really matter. He should have told vivid evidence really works. He should have told Goodfriend, you are likely to ruin your life and disgrace your family and lose your money. And is Mosier worth this? I know both men. That would have worked. So Feuerstein flunked elementary psychology, this very sophisticated, brilliant lawyer. Well, don't you do that. It's not very hard to do, just to remember that why is terribly important. Other normal limitations of sensation, memory, cognition, and knowledge, well, I don't have time for that. Stress-induced mental changes. Here my favorite example is the great Pavlov. And he had all these dogs in cages which had all been conditioned into changed behaviors. And the great Leningrad flood came and just went right up, and the dog's in a cage. And the dog had as much stress as you can imagine a dog ever having. And the water receded in time to save some of the dogs. And Pavlov noted that they'd had a total reversal of their conditioned personality. Well, being the great scientist he was, he spent the rest of his life giving nervous breakdowns to dogs. And he learned a hell of a lot that I regard as very interesting. I have never known any Freudian analyst who knew anything about the last work of Pavlov. And I've never met a lawyer who understood that what Pavlov found out with those dogs had anything to do with programming and deprogramming and cults and so forth. I mean, the amount of elementary psychological ignorance is there in high levels is very substantial. Then we've got other common mental illnesses and declines, temporary and permanent, including the tendency to lose ability through disuse. And then I've got mental and organizational confusion from say-something syndrome. And here my favorite thing is the bee, the honeybee. And the honeybee goes out and finds the nectar, and he comes back, he does a dance that communicates to the other bees where the nectar is, and they go out and get it. Well, some scientist who was clever, like B.F. Skinner, decided to do an experiment. He put the nectar straight up, way up. Well, in a natural setting, there is no nectar way the hell straight up. And the honeybee doesn't have a genetic program that is adequate to handle what he now has to communicate. And you'd think the honeybee would come back to the hive and slink into a corner. But he doesn't. He comes into the hive and does this incoherent dance. And all my life I've been dealing with the human equivalent of that honeybee. And it's a very important part of human organization to set things up so the noise and the reciprocation and so forth of all these people who have what I call say-something syndrome don't really affect the decisions. Now, the time has come to ask 2 or 3 questions. This is the most important question in this whole talk. What happens when these standard psychological tendencies combine? What happens when the situation or the artful manipulation of man causes several of these tendencies to operate on a person toward the same end at the same time? The clear answer is the combination greatly increases power to change behavior compared to the power of merely one tendency acting alone. Examples are Tupperware parties. Tupperware has now made billions of dollars out of a few manipulative psychological tricks. It was so schlock that directors of Justin Dart's company resigned when he crammed it down his board's throat. And he was totally right, by the way, judged by economic outcomes. Mooney conversion methods. Boy, do they work. He just combines 4 or 5 of these things together. The system of Alcoholics Anonymous. A 50% no drinking rate. Outcome when everything else fails. It's a very clever system that uses 4 or 5 psychological systems at once toward, I might say, a very good end. The Milgram experiment. See, Milgram, it's been widely interpreted as mere obedience. But the truth of the matter is that the experimenter who got the students to give the heavy shocks in Milgram, he explained why. It was a false explanation. We need this to look for scientific truth and so on. That greatly changed the behavior of the people. And number 2, he worked them up. Tiny shock, little larger. So commitment and consistency tendency and the contrast principle were both working in favor of this behavior. So again, it's 4 different psychological tendencies. That's when you get these Lollapalooza effects, you will almost always find 4 or 5 of these things working together. What you should search for in life is the combination, because the combination is likely to do you in. Or if you're the inventor of Tupperware parties, it's likely to make you enormously rich if you can stand shaving when you do it. Then one of my favorite cases is the McDonnell Douglas airliner evacuation disaster. The government requires that airliners pass a bunch of tests. One of them is evacuation. Get everybody out, I think it's 90 seconds or something like that. It's some short period of time. The government has rules, make it very realistic, so on and so on. You can't select nothing but 20-year-old athletes to evacuate your airliner. So McDonnell Douglas schedules one of these things in a hangar, and they make the hangar dark, and the concrete floor is 25 feet down, and they got these little rubber chutes, and they got all these old people, and they ring the bell, and they all rush out, and in the morning, when the first test is done, they create 20 terrible injuries. People go off to hospitals. And of course, they scheduled another one for the afternoon. By the way, they didn't meet the time schedule either, in addition to causing all the injuries. Well, so what do? They do it again in the afternoon. Now they create 20 more injuries and 1 case of a severed spinal column with permanent unfixable paralysis. These are engineers, these are brilliant people, this is thought over through in a big bureaucracy. Again, it's a combination of a tendency. Authorities told you to do it. He told you to make it realistic. You've decided to do it. You've decided to do it twice. Incentive cost bias. If you pass, you save a lot of money. You've got to jump this hurdle before you can sell your new airliner. Again, 3, 4, 5 of these things work together, and it turns human brains into mush. And maybe you think this doesn't happen in picking investments? If so, you're living in a different world than I am. Finally, the open outcry auction. Well, the open outcry auction is just made to turn the brain into mush. You get social proof, the other guy is bidding, you get reciprocation tendency, you get deprival superreaction syndrome, the thing is going away. I mean, it's just absolutely designed to manipulate people into idiotic behavior. Finally, the institution of the board of directors of a major human American company. Well, the top guy is sitting there. He's an authority figure. He's doing asinine things. You look around the board. Nobody else is objecting. Social proof, it's okay. Reciprocation tendency. He's raising the director's fees every year. He's flying you around in the corporate airplane to look at interesting plants or whatever the hell they do. And you go. And you really get extreme dysfunction as a corrective decision-making body in the typical American board of directors. They only act, again, the power of incentives, they only act when it gets so bad that it starts reflecting, making them look foolish or threatening legal liability to them. That's Munger's rule. I mean, there are occasional things that don't follow Munger's rule, but by and large, the board of directors is a very ineffective corrector if the top guy is a little nuts, which of course frequently happens.